My name is Beverly. I'm 34 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I learned something most people never fully understand until it's too late. Family can love the role you play without ever loving you. My parents taught me that lesson in their marble kitchen, beneath imported chandeliers and the smell of fresh garden roses, while my mother adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist and told me, in the calmest voice imaginable, "Your sister owes $420,000 plus penalties. By Friday, it will be $500,000. You are paying it, or you are no longer our daughter." Just like that. No hesitation, no shame, no pause to consider what she was asking. I looked at her. Then I looked at my father, William, standing beside the island with his eyes fixed on the polished leather of his loafers, too cowardly to meet my gaze. And in that moment, something inside me went completely still, because this wasn't really about money. It never was. It was about 34 years of being the backup child, the reliable one, the invisible one, the daughter they expected to absorb every consequence of my sister Savannah's recklessness, while she floated through life wrapped in praise, excuses, and designer labels. They expected me to cry. They expected me to panic. They expected me to start bargaining, apologizing, reaching for my phone, opening my accounts, shrinking back into the role they had assigned me before I was old enough to question it. I did none of those things. I looked at both of them and said very quietly, "Then I'm not." Then I turned around, walked out the front door, got into my car, and called my bank before I even started the engine. 3 days later, my phone would show 98 missed calls from my family. I wouldn't answer a single one. I would send only one text back, 2 words, "Too late." But to understand why my own parents tried to extort $500,000 from me to save the sister who had spent her entire life standing on my neck, you need to understand the trap they thought they had built. They believed I was just their quiet daughter, the boring one, the woman who worked with spreadsheets and wore practical shoes and somehow had money simply because she never lived. What they forgot was that I'm not an accountant. I'm a forensic accountant. I don't just read numbers, I read lies. And before this was over, I was going to read every single one of theirs. So let me take you back to the exact night it started, to a long mahogany dining table in Wellesley, Massachusetts, to a staged family dinner, and to the moment my parents handed me the very weapon I would use to destroy everything they had spent decades protecting. It started with a text from my mother on Thursday morning. No greeting, no explanation, just the usual command wrapped in the cold efficiency she reserved for people she considered beneath discussion. Family dinner tomorrow at 7. Mandatory. Savannah and Trent are facing a crisis. In my family, mandatory never meant invitation. It meant summons. By then, I already knew something was wrong. My mother didn't gather the family unless there was an emergency, or unless she needed an audience. I drove out to Wellesley after work the following evening, leaving Boston behind as the roads widened, the trees thickened, and the houses retreated farther and farther from the street like wealth itself needed privacy. Everything in that suburb was built to imply permanence. Clean hedges, iron gates, long private drives, the kind of neighborhood where appearances mattered more than truth. And my family had built their entire identity around maintaining both. My parents' estate sat at the end of a curved driveway framed by stone lanterns and manicured yews. Even from the road, it looked like a magazine spread. Pale stone exterior, black shutters, glowing windows, imported landscaping. And Savannah's white SUV was already there, parked crookedly near the entrance like she owned the place. That, more than anything, told me this wasn't a family dinner. It was a performance. My father opened the front door before I knocked. He looked pale, tighter than usual, the lines around his mouth deeper. For a brief moment I thought maybe, just maybe, this was real fear. But he didn't hug me, didn't greet me, didn't ask how I was. He simply stepped aside and said, "They're waiting." Of course they were. The formal dining room was already staged when I walked in. Savannah sat at the far end of the table, face blotchy, mascara smudged, clutching a linen napkin like she was auditioning for sympathy. My mother stood behind her with one manicured hand on her shoulder, radiating protective outrage. The overhead chandelier cast a soft gold light across polished silver, crystal stemware, and a meal no one had touched. Not one person had thought to wait for me before beginning the scene. I took my seat opposite Savannah and folded my hands in my lap. No one offered me wine. No one offered me food. That was the first clue. The second was Savannah's crying. She never cried unless someone was watching. My sister had been the center of gravity in our family for as long as I could remember. She was beautiful in the expensive, curated way our mother adored. Golden hair, bright smile, effortless charm. The kind of woman who could walk into a room and make people underestimate the cost of keeping her there. I, on the other hand, had always been the practical daughter. Too quiet, too serious, too self-contained. Savannah was celebrated. I was utilized. When she got into private school, my parents hosted dinner parties. When I got academic scholarships, they nodded and changed the subject. When Savannah married Trent, an overconfident venture capitalist with a leased Porsche, immaculate veneers, and the polished arrogance of a man who confused debt with success, my parents acted as if royalty had entered the bloodline. When I worked nights to pay for UMass and later built my own firm from the ground up, they described me as good with money, the same way someone might describe a refrigerator as reliable, useful, functional, emotionally irrelevant. So when I saw Savannah dabbing tears from her face, I knew exactly what role I'd been called in to play. Clean up. Again. I looked around the table. "Where's Trent?" I asked. Savannah let out a dramatic sob and buried her face in her hands. My mother shot me a warning look. "He's with legal counsel." That got my attention. My father cleared his throat and pulled a thick manila folder from his briefcase. He placed it on the table and slid it toward me. "Open it." I didn't touch it immediately. I just looked at the folder. "I handle fraud for a living. Corporate theft, hidden transfers, shell entities, falsified ledgers, embezzlement disguised as clerical error. I know what ruin looks like on paper." And this folder looked heavy. I opened it. Inside was exactly what I expected, and somehow worse. Default notices, creditor warnings, formal demands, pre-litigation correspondence, partial loan schedules, payment acceleration letters, redacted in places, yes, but not enough, not nearly enough. Within 30 seconds, I had the outline. Trent's latest startup hadn't merely stumbled, it had detonated. He'd borrowed against inflated assets, used bridge financing to cover prior obligations, mixed business and personal accounts, and drawn money through channels no legitimate lender would touch if they'd been given the truth. This wasn't a temporary liquidity issue. This was a financial sinkhole. And if the documents were accurate, federal scrutiny was already hovering. Savannah was still crying. My mother was still pretending this was tragedy instead of consequence. My father gripped the back of his chair and said, "They are about to lose everything." I turned another page. "How much?" I asked. He inhaled slowly. $420,000 today. With penalties and immediate intervention costs, it's closer to 500 by Friday. I looked up. No one spoke. And then I understood. They weren't informing me. They were measuring my reaction. I closed the folder halfway. "And," my mother answered, "we need you to cover it." Just like that. No request, no humility, no hesitation. As if $500,000 was a family casserole someone needed me to bring. I stared at her. "You want me to what?" Savannah lifted her face, mascara streaked and trembling. "You have the money, Bev." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the audacity was so total it momentarily stopped feeling real. "You want me to drain my personal assets and my firm's capital," I said slowly, "to rescue Trent from fraudulent commercial debt?" "It's not fraud," Savannah snapped, suddenly less fragile now that the core demand was on the table. "It's a cash flow crisis." I looked down at the documents again. "No, it's fraud." My mother's mouth tightened. Family protects family. There it was, the line toxic people use when they mean, "You exist to absorb damage we don't want to carry ourselves." I leaned back in my chair. For one dangerous second, everyone in that room thought I might agree. Because that was the role I had always played. The reasonable one. The one who adjusted. The one who tolerated. The one who stayed calm while they shifted the burden onto her shoulders and called it love. But something had changed. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe it was finally understanding that if I saved them this time, they would never stop. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. "No." The word landed hard. Savannah's tears stopped instantly. My mother lowered her wine glass. My father's face darkened. "Excuse me?" he said. I said no. Savannah let out a disbelieving laugh. "You can't be serious." "I'm perfectly serious," I said. "Trent made reckless financial decisions. You enabled them. And now everyone is shocked that debt has consequences." My mother's voice sharpened. "Do not speak to your sister that way." I ignored her. "If the house goes, it goes. If Trent needs criminal counsel, hire him one. If you need to sell jewelry, vehicles, or the estate to cover your preferred child's implosion, then do that. But I am not wiring $500,000 to prop up a lifestyle built on lies." Savannah stood so abruptly her chair scraped the floor. "You bitter little—" "Sit down," my mother snapped. Not at me, at her. Because appearances mattered, even then. I stood instead. I had no intention of staying for the screaming phase. "I think we're done here." And that was the moment everything changed. Because I expected yelling. I expected guilt. I expected my mother to hiss something venomous, and my father to throw his voice around like authority could manufacture obedience. Instead, they smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, coldly, knowingly. My mother's expression shifted first. The panic disappeared. The indignation softened into something far more dangerous: confidence. My father straightened and reached back into his briefcase. "Sit down, Beverly," he said. I stopped. There are moments in life when your instincts move faster than thought. My entire body went cold before I understood why. People who are desperate do not get calmer when refused. People who are losing everything do not smile when the money walks away, unless they believe the money can't leave. I turned slowly. My father withdrew a single sheet of paper and laid it flat on the table between us. "You don't have a choice," he said. My mother folded her hands and added, "Look at the guarantor line." I sat back down, not because they ordered me to, because suddenly I needed to know exactly how dangerous they had become. I pulled the page closer. Commercial bridge loan agreement, institution name, principal amount, default acceleration clause, then the signature page. And there it was, my name, my full legal name, my social security number, and beneath it, on the guarantor line, my signature, or rather, a very good imitation of it. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The upward slant of the B, the loop in the Y, the long tail at the end I only use on formal documents. Someone had practiced it. Someone had studied my handwriting long enough to reproduce it with confidence. I felt the room tilt. This wasn't emotional blackmail anymore. This wasn't family pressure. This was identity theft, wire fraud, forgery, a calculated criminal act executed by the two people who had refused to co-sign my student loans when I was 18 because, according to them, I needed to learn responsibility. I looked at my father. "You forged my signature." My mother had the audacity to sigh. "Don't be melodramatic." "Mellow. This was necessary," she said. "Savannah and Trent needed urgent financing, and your financial profile made approval possible." My father leaned forward. "If this loan defaults, your business accounts are exposed as guarantor assets. The lender will come after your firm, your savings, everything. So you will wire the funds, or you will watch your entire professional life get liquidated." I stared at both of them in disbelief so profound it almost felt like silence. They hadn't just asked me to sacrifice myself. They had already tied me to the bomb. My firm flashed through my mind. 5 employees, payroll cycles, leases, insurance, client retainers, live audits in process. People depended on me, not just my livelihood, other people's. And my parents had risked all of it to save Savannah from downsizing and Trent from consequences. Savannah sniffed and leaned forward. "You have to help us now. Help us." The phrase almost made me laugh. They had forged my identity, attached me to $500,000 of fraudulent debt, and were now framing my rescue of myself as help for them. That was the exact moment the shock burned off, and beneath it, something colder took its place: clarity. Because while they were still seeing me as the quiet, dutiful daughter who managed numbers, I was now looking at the mechanics. Commercial bridge loans of that size require specific compliance procedures: verified signatures, notarial control, authentication trails, transfer logs, underwriting records, IP footprints, timestamps. They thought the presence of my forged name would scare me into paying. Instead, they had handed a forensic accountant a federal crime scene. I lowered my eyes back to the document and made myself breathe evenly. This part mattered. If I reacted too hard, too fast, if they sensed danger, they could move money, destroy records, warn Trent, disappear evidence. So I did the smartest thing I've ever done in my life. I pretended to break. I let my shoulders drop. I let my hand tremble. I stared at the paper long enough for them to mistake my silence for fear. Then I said very softly, "I need 3 days." The exhale around the table was almost comical. My mother relaxed first. Savannah's entire body loosened. My father leaned back with the smug satisfaction of a man who thought he had just won. "Friday by 5, he said. I nodded once. Savannah sprang up, suddenly radiant. She actually moved toward me with open arms like gratitude had already been earned. "I knew you'd come through, Bev." I stepped away before she touched me. 3 days, I repeated. Then I picked up my bag, turned, and walked out of that house without another word. I closed the front door gently behind me. Not because I was calm, because by then, I already knew this wasn't ending with a family argument. It was ending with a takedown. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sat in the dark for exactly 12 seconds. Then I picked up my phone and made one call. "Valerie," I said when she answered, "my parents forged my signature on a $500,000 commercial loan." There was a pause. Then she said, "Come to my office, right now." Valerie Mercer was one of the most ruthless corporate litigators in Boston, which is why I trusted her. She wasn't sentimental, and she didn't waste language pretending bad people were complicated when evidence proved otherwise. We'd worked together years earlier on an embezzlement case involving a medical supply chain. I traced the money. She dismantled the executives. Since then, whenever I encountered something legally toxic, she was the first person I called. Her office occupied a glass corner suite high above the harbor. By the time I arrived, 2 cups of black coffee were waiting on her desk, and her jacket was draped over the back of her chair, like she had already settled in for war. "Start from the beginning," she said. So I did. I told her everything. The summons to dinner, the folder, the demand, the forged guarantor agreement, the Friday deadline. She didn't interrupt once. She only took notes. When I finished, she sat back and said, "Your family is spectacularly stupid." That, more than sympathy would have, steadied me. "Can they actually come after my firm?" I asked. "If the loan stands uncontested long enough, they can try. But that's not the real issue." She tapped her pen against the table. "The real issue is that your father and brother-in-law committed multiple federal offenses and dragged your professional identity into the middle of them, which means we do not treat this like a family dispute. We treat it like organized financial fraud." And that was the moment I knew I was going to survive. Because there's something strangely liberating about hearing the truth in precise language. Not betrayal, evidence, not heartbreak, exposure, not family drama, criminal conduct. We worked until nearly 3 a.m, not on a denial letter, not on a polite objection, on a strategy. A full, silent, devastating strategy. First, we documented my alibi for the date the agreement had supposedly been signed and notarized. That part was almost elegant in its simplicity. On the day the paperwork claimed I had appeared in Boston, I had actually been in Chicago speaking at a national forensic auditing summit. I had airline records, hotel logs, time-stamped conference credentials, photos, event schedules, even a panel transcript. I was 600 miles away. Second, we identified the lender and mapped the compliance failures. No institution wants to discover that a 6-figure commercial instrument was approved using a forged guarantor backed by a false notarization. That kind of error doesn't just create legal risk, it creates regulatory exposure. Third, we followed Trent, because men like Trent never run one fraud at a time. And sure enough, when I started cross-referencing his entities, holding companies, and UCC filings, the first cracks opened quickly. He had formed a Delaware shell company just weeks earlier. Registered agent? My father. I stared at the filing on Valerie's screen and felt the pieces slide into place. "This wasn't about saving Savannah," I said. Valerie nodded. "No, Savannah's crisis was just the emotional bait." We kept digging. The more I traced, the uglier it got. Trent's startup was collapsing, yes, but the money trail suggested something else was happening behind the scenes. Funds weren't just being directed to immediate creditors. They were being rerouted through intermediate structures designed to create distance between source and destination, which meant laundering, maybe crude, maybe panicked, but laundering all the same. "Your father isn't just covering for Savannah," Valerie said. "He's protecting himself." And suddenly the whole thing made sense. My father had always presented himself as a financially untouchable patriarch, retired executive, smart investor, disciplined strategist, the man who made all the money decisions while my mother played social queen and Savannah lived as if money appeared by divine favor. But if he was routing money through shell structures tied to Trent, then this wasn't just rescue, it was desperation. At 3:07 a.m., Valerie looked at me over the rim of her coffee cup and said, "You understand this ends with arrests, right?" I looked out at the black harbor beyond the glass. "Yes," I said, and for the first time in my life, I meant it without guilt. The next 48 hours were a master class in quiet destruction. By Wednesday morning, the machine was already moving. Valerie and I filed the identity theft affidavit, sterile, bureaucratic, precise. I filled out forms that required me to type my parents' names into fields marked suspected parties. The strangeness of that should have broken something in me. It didn't, because by then, I had crossed the emotional line that matters most. The point where someone's title in your life no longer excuses what they've done. Mother, father, sister. Those words had stopped meaning protection. They were just identifiers now. The lender's fraud division took the case seriously almost immediately. It helped that I knew exactly how to speak their language. I wasn't a frightened civilian making vague accusations. I was a forensic professional presenting a structured fraud claim supported by documentation, alibi evidence, and compliance breaches. When the senior investigator called back, I gave him everything. The supposed signing date, the impossible location conflict, the signature anomalies, the notary issue, the related entities, the exposure risk. Then I sent the proof. Flight manifest, hotel folio, conference badge, time-stamped event photos, credit card receipts from Chicago, panel listing, swipe logs. He reviewed it and called me back less than an hour later. His tone had changed, which is corporate language for, "This is bigger bigger than we first thought. By then, I'd already pulled more of Trent's financial pathways into focus, and that was when I found the brokerage account. Not Savannah's, not Trent's, my father's. I sat frozen at Valerie's conference table, staring at the ownership data. There it was. Some of the loan money, or at least money directly connected to the routed structure, had been diverted toward an account tied to my father's personal losses. So the truth was even uglier than I first believed. They weren't just stealing from me to save Savannah's image. They were using Savannah's implosion as cover to bail out my father's failing investments. He had gambled badly, probably leveraged where he shouldn't have, probably lost more than he could admit without destroying the illusion of competence that held the family hierarchy together. And when the walls started closing in, they chose me as the sacrifice. I remember leaning back in my chair and feeling the last shred of filial hesitation disintegrate. There is something clarifying about discovering that your exploitation was never even about love misplaced. It was just greed. Pure, naked, transactional greed. I told the bank investigator I wanted a freeze, but not immediately. That mattered. If the accounts froze too soon, they could panic, shift assets, purge devices, destroy records. I wanted them comfortable, confident. I wanted them to think Friday was still coming exactly as planned. He agreed. The freeze would go live Friday morning at 9, which meant I had just over 24 hours left. And that was when Savannah made the biggest mistake of her life. She came to my condo. Thursday afternoon, gray sky, cold air, my kitchen still smelling faintly of coffee and cedar cleaner. I was reviewing client documents when the concierge buzzed to say my sister was downstairs. I almost refused her. Then I realized what an entitled person does when they think victory is already theirs. They talk, so I let her up. She walked into my home like she was entering a hotel suite I should have offered her years ago. Beige cashmere set, Chanel bag, expensive perfume, sunglasses perched on her head. She looked less like a woman on the edge of financial ruin and more like someone running 15 minutes late for Pilates. "Mom says you've gone quiet," she said, dropping her keys on my counter. "That's not cute." I looked at her for a beat and then said, "Do you want coffee?" She blinked, mildly surprised. Entitled people always are when you don't react the way they rehearsed. While I turned toward the espresso machine, I slid my phone across the counter, unlocked it with my thumb, and started recording without looking down. Then I gave her exactly what she expected: a nervous sister, a frightened woman, a reluctant victim. "I'm just trying to understand how bad this is," I said quietly. "Savannah, they forged my name." She actually rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, Beverly, stop being dramatic. No one is going to jail." I kept my body still. No sudden reaction. No sharp intake of breath. Just enough concern to keep her talking. "Dad handled the notary," she added carelessly. There it was. I handed her the coffee. "What about Trent?" I asked. She took a sip. "He needed the cash for Vegas." I looked at her. "Vegas?" She shrugged. "Investor trip. He can't look weak right now." For a second, I thought I'd misheard. The bridge loan they'd framed as urgent, life or death asset protection financing was being used, at least in part, for Trent to play successful in Las Vegas. That alone would have been enough to make me walk her out of my home. But I needed more, so I made my voice smaller. "You and Dad planned this?" She laughed. Not nervous laughter. Mean laughter. The kind I had heard since childhood whenever she wanted to remind me I was always half a step beneath her in the family order. "Oh, please. Dad signed the paperwork. Trent ran it through his contact. I just kept you occupied that weekend." I gripped the counter beneath the line of sight of her eyes. That weekend. 2 months earlier, Savannah had called me sobbing, saying she needed me to stay at her house because her dog was sick and she couldn't cope emotionally. I had canceled client meetings to help her. The dog had been fine, while I was babysitting her perfectly healthy golden retriever. My father had apparently been forging my signature. I turned slowly and looked at her. "You set me up," she waved a hand. "Don't be so sensitive. We needed the money and you were sitting on it. Sitting on it." That's how she described everything I had built. Years of 80-hour weeks. Graduating without help. Starting my own firm. Growing it case by case. Protecting every cent. To Savannah, it was an achievement. It was unused inventory. I let one more beat pass. Then I asked the question that would lock the whole thing down. "So Dad signed it, Trent processed it, and you knew?" She sighed dramatically, impatient now. "Yes, Beverly. Fine. We all knew." "Happy?" I smiled. A real smile. Small, controlled, final. "Very," I said. She didn't notice. She checked her watch, picked up her bag, and headed for the door. "Just make sure the transfer clears tomorrow by noon," she said. "Trent hates waiting on wires." "I'll make sure he gets exactly what he deserves," I replied, and then she left. The second the door shut, I stopped the recording and sent the file directly to Valerie. She called me within 4 minutes. "Do not lose that phone," she said. "I won't." Good, because your sister just confessed to conspiracy, forgery participation, and premeditation in your kitchen over espresso. Friday morning, I woke up before sunrise feeling calmer than I had in years. Not happy, not vindicated, calm. There's a very specific peace that comes from knowing the truth is documented, the evidence is secure, and the people who tried to corner you are about to step into consequences they don't yet know are waiting. I made coffee, opened the blinds, watched the city lighten over the harbor. Then I put my phone on Do Not Disturb and laid it face down on the counter. At 9 o'clock sharp, the lender executed the freeze, not just on the disputed loan, on everything linked to the active fraud inquiry, connected accounts, shared personal lines, corporate holdings, credit products, brokerage access. People who have never dealt with real financial enforcement imagine it begins with dramatic phone calls and men in suits. Often it begins with decline notifications. A platinum card that stops working, a transfer that won't process, an app login that suddenly shows restriction banners, a brokerage dashboard that locks, a debit swipe that returns insufficient access. And for people who build their whole identity around financial control, that kind of silence is terror. At 9:14, the first call came in. My mother, then my father, then Savannah, then all three again. By 10:30, the calls were multiplying fast enough to make my counter vibrate. I finally turned the phone over. 12 missed calls from my mother, 24 from my father, 40 from Savannah. Texts piled beneath them. My card was declined. What did you do? Trent's accounts are frozen. Call the bank. This is insane. Fix it. Fix it. That was the word they always returned to, as if destruction appeared out of nowhere, and I was morally required to reverse it for them. By 12:45, my father sent the first message that told me he finally understood the seriousness of what was happening. The bank says we are under investigation for fraud. Pick up the phone. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I put it back down and finished my coffee. By early afternoon, I had 98 missed calls. And then my father made one final mistake. He sent a message that read, "We are gathering the family at the house at 4. You will be here to fix this, or you are dead to us." I actually laughed, because he still thought exile was a threat. He still believed their approval had value. He still imagined that if he assembled enough relatives in one room, shame would do what extortion couldn't. He was wrong, but he had unknowingly given me something useful, a stage. I forwarded the message to Valerie. Then I sent a single reply. Too late. At exactly 4 o'clock, I pulled up to my parents' house and immediately understood what they'd planned. The driveway was packed. Mercedes, BMWs, Volvos, Range Rovers, my aunts, my uncles, cousins, spouses. Nearly every branch of the extended family within driving distance. Of course, my mother's favorite weapon had always been public humiliation. Never correction, performance. If she could shame me in front of an audience, she believed she could force me back into line. I parked on the street instead of the drive. I wasn't going to let any of them block my car in. Then I took my briefcase from the passenger seat and walked to the front door. Inside, the house was full. The living room buzzed with low conversation that died the second I stepped through the foyer. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. My mother moved first. She rushed toward me with tears already falling, voice breaking on cue. "How could you do this, Beverly?" she cried. "We asked for a simple family loan, and now all our accounts are frozen. Your sister is devastated. Your father is under attack. We are ruined." The performance would have been impressive if I hadn't been the victim of the crime she was describing as inconvenience. Before I could respond, my Uncle Richard stepped forward. Corporate attorney, self-appointed moral authority, expert in speaking as if his opinions were rulings. He looked at me with disgust and said, "Your sister is facing a temporary setback and you retaliate by destroying your own family." There it was. The narrative had already been planted. Greedy daughter, heartless sister, vindictive loner, money-obsessed success machine. My mother had gathered them as witnesses to my supposed cruelty. What she had actually gathered them for was evidence. I walked straight past Richard, didn't answer him, didn't even slow down. I went to the center of the room, placed my briefcase on the glass coffee table, and opened it. The metal latches snapped loudly in the silence. Everyone watched. I removed a stack of blue folders, neatly labeled, indexed, organized. One by one, I began handing them out. To Richard, to Aunt Susan, to 2 cousins, to my father's brother, to anyone close enough to matter. My mother's crying faltered. My father took one step forward. I looked at the room and said, "Open to page 2. No one moved for a second. Then Richard did. And once one person begins reading evidence, the rest follow fast. Paper rustled, eyes scanned, expressions instructions changed. Page 2 contained the bridge loan signature page, my name, my social security number, the forged signature. I let them sit with it before I spoke. That, I said evenly, is the commercial bridge loan my father and brother-in-law secured using my forged identity. The room shifted. Aunt Susan frowned. Why is Beverly listed as guarantor? Because they forged it, I said. My father exploded. That is not what happened. It is exactly what happened. And the only flaw in your plan is that I was in Chicago on the day this document was supposedly signed and notarized in Boston. Silence. Real silence. The kind that falls when people realize they may have entered a room on the wrong side of a crime. Richard's face changed first. He flipped the page, then another, then another. Page 4 held the trace matrix. That's where the room truly began to fracture. Because page 4 showed where the money went, not just toward Trent's collapsing business exposure, toward a Delaware shell structure, and from there to my father's brokerage account. I let that land. Then I said, my parents told me this was about saving Savannah's home. It wasn't. They used Savannah's crisis as cover to divert money toward my father's investment losses. My father turned white. My mother actually stopped breathing for half a second. Uncle Richard looked up from the file with genuine horror. You routed stolen loan capital into a personal brokerage vehicle, he said to my father. William didn't answer. He didn't need to. The paperwork had already done it for him. I could have stopped there. It would have been enough. But arrogance had given me one final gift. I reached into my blazer pocket, took out my phone, connected to the house Bluetooth system I already knew by heart, and pressed play. Savannah's voice filled the room, clear, loud, unmistakable. Oh, stop being dramatic, Beverly. Nobody is going to jail. Dad handled the notary. A collective gasp moved through the family like a single organism. Savannah, perched on the staircase in carefully chosen victim mode, froze. The recording continued. Dad signed the actual paperwork. Trent processed it with his banking contact. I just provided the distraction by asking you to dog sit that weekend. I paused the recording. The silence afterward was suffocating. No one in that room could pretend anymore. Not misunderstanding, not family tension, not confusion, conspiracy, premeditation, fraud. My mother staggered backward. My father looked like a man realizing gravity exists halfway through a fall. Then the front door knocked. Heavy, official, final. The entire room turned. Another knock. My father gripped the mantle. My mother whispered, "What did you do?" I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I answered without any need to soften the truth. "I believed you," I said. She stared. "In the kitchen, when you told me that if I didn't pay, I wasn't your daughter anymore." Another knock. Louder. I held her gaze. So I stopped acting like one. My uncle opened the door. Two uniformed officers entered first. Behind them came the bank's lead investigator, carrying a leather case and the kind of expression that says, documentation is no longer a debate. The senior officer scanned the room and asked for William and Beatrice by name. My mother made a sound I will never forget. Not a sob, not a scream, the sound of status cracking. The officer announced active warrants related to wire fraud and identity theft. Everything broke at once. My father started shouting. My mother started pleading. Aunt Susan backed into a wall. Richard looked furious, not at me, but at the fact that he had walked into a living room expecting family drama and found federal exposure instead. And then Trent tried to run. Apparently he had been hiding in the back of the house, which was perfectly consistent with the kind of man who loves risk right up until consequences develop a spine. He made it exactly 3 steps toward the rear doors before the investigator intercepted him and informed him he was not leaving the property. Savannah panicked. Not for me, not for our parents, for herself. She pointed at my father and shrieked, "It was his idea." I will remember that forever. Because in one sentence, the golden child proved what I had known all along. She never loved them. She loved being funded by them. "Dad forged it," she cried. "Trent filed it, but Dad set it up." My mother looked at her as if she'd been stabbed. My father simply stared. The daughter they had protected, privileged, financed, excused, and prioritized for 34 years had sold them out in less than 10 seconds to save herself. And that, more than the arrest, more than the warrants, more than the frozen accounts, was the moment the family actually died. Because the lie at the center of our structure had finally been exposed. I was never the disloyal one. I was the only one in that house who understood what loyalty actually costs. I didn't stay for the handcuffs. I didn't need to. I gathered my documents, closed my briefcase, and walked out while the house dissolved behind me. No grand speech, no tears, no backward glance, just the crisp autumn air, my keys in my hand, and the unmistakable lightness of a chain finally falling away. The drive back to Boston was silent. I didn't turn on music, didn't rehearse conversations, didn't cry, because grief had already happened years before. I just hadn't named it yet. What I felt instead was relief. Deep, strange, liberating relief. The kind that comes when you stop trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. The fallout began immediately. Over the next 3 weeks, the collapse was biblical. Trent's firm moved first. Men like him survive on optics, and nothing poisons optics faster than active fraud exposure tied to investor money and falsified commercial instruments. He was pushed out fast, cut off from internal systems, erased from the website, locked out before lunch. The leased cars disappeared soon after. The Chestnut Hill house fell under lean pressure. Accounts stayed frozen. The lenders didn't relax. Regulators don't care about your curated image. They care about paper trails. My parents, meanwhile, discovered what happens when social privilege collides with public record. The initial arrest filings became visible. A local reporter picked up the story. Then the broader circle found out. Country club boards love morality clauses when scandal belongs to someone else. My mother's membership was revoked within days. The same women she had spent decades impressing began forwarding articles about her in private group chats before the ink was dry. My father, who had spent his life treating money like proof of authority, suddenly couldn't access his own. And the voicemails started, at first angry, then frantic, then pathetic. My father, Beverly, answer the phone. We can resolve this privately. My mother, please, sweetheart, this has gone too far. Savannah, Bev, please, Trent could go to prison. There's something almost offensive about hearing people beg for mercy only after consequences arrive. Not after betrayal, not after theft, not after extortion, after inconvenience. I saved every voicemail, archived every text, then ignored them all. About a month later, I got a letter from my mother on heavy cream stationery. Elegant, careful, trembling script, an apology, or what looked like one. She wrote that the past few weeks had opened her eyes, that panic had clouded their judgment, that they had lost sight of what mattered, that she wanted healing, that she wanted her daughter back. 10 years earlier, that letter might have destroyed me. At 24, I probably would have cried over it. At 34, I took it to my therapist. Dr. Evans had spent 3 years helping me untangle the architecture of my family. She read the letter in silence, set it down, and said something I think every scapegoated child eventually has to hear. They are not apologizing because they understand your pain. They are apologizing because the resource fought back. I sat very still, and she continued. In their internal system, you were never fully a daughter. You were utility, stability, backup. They're not mourning emotional loss. They're reacting to disrupted access. That sentence changed me, because it named what I had spent my life feeling without language. I wasn't unloved in the ordinary sense. I was misassigned, cast in a role where my worth depended on what I could absorb, provide, fix, fund, or forgive. My mother's apology wasn't reconciliation. It was strategy. Maybe conscious, maybe not. But strategy all the same. A final attempt to restore control before trial. So I did something symbolic, and perhaps a little dramatic, but I have never regretted it. I took the letter, held a lighter to one corner, and let it burn inside Dr. Evans' office trash can while she watched in silence. I didn't burn it because I was angry. I burned it because I was done hoping. And hope, in families like mine, can be the most dangerous addiction of all. After that, I made the separation official. I changed my last name. Not impulsively, legally, cleanly, completely. I took my grandmother's maiden name and signed the paperwork in probate court with a hand that did not shake. Then I locked down every financial vulnerability I had left. Trust structures, account protections, legal exclusions, access barriers, documentation layers. Every future dollar I earned would sit behind walls no one in my bloodline could ever breach again. And then something unexpected happened. My career exploded. My parents had always threatened that public scandal would ruin me. They were wrong. The financial world didn't see a daughter who sent her family to the authorities. They saw a woman who could not be bought, blackmailed, or emotionally manipulated away from the truth. CEOs noticed. Boards noticed. Compliance departments noticed. Within 6 months, my client base tripled. I leased more office space, hired senior analysts, expanded beyond what I had once considered my maximum sustainable growth. Turns out, in corporate fraud circles, there is nothing more reassuring than a forensic accountant willing to indict her own lineage when the evidence requires it. Eventually, I bought something else too. A house on the Cape, waterfront, quiet, cedar shingled, broad windows facing the Atlantic. Not flashy, not performative, just peaceful. It had everything my mother had always wanted and never quite reached because she spent her life chasing status instead of building security. I bought it in cash. Then I sat on the deck at sunset and realized something almost absurd in its simplicity. I had built the dream, not theirs, mine. Months later, Savannah found a way to contact me. Unknown number, short message. She and Trent were divorcing. The house was gone. She was in a studio apartment near the highway, bankrupt, desperate, alone. Then came the line that might once have worked. I'm your sister. Can I stay with you for a few months until I get on my feet? I read it twice. Then I looked out at the ocean, and I understood that this was the final test, not of my kindness, of my boundaries. The old Beverly would have explained, softened, negotiated, maybe even made room, but explanations are for people who seek understanding in good faith. Savannah never had, so I sent 2 sentences. You made your choice. Do not contact me again. Then I blocked the number, and that was that. The legal cases resolved roughly the way Valerie had predicted. My parents took plea agreements rather than face the full destruction of trial. Their penalties were brutal in the ways that mattered most to them, financially, socially, reputationally. The estate was gone. The status was gone. The illusion of untouchability was gone. Trent served time. His career evaporated. Savannah, for the first time in her life, got a job. I heard through someone who knew someone that she was folding discounted sweaters in a department store and ringing up customers who looked right through her. I won't lie. There was irony in that, but not joy. Because by then, I no longer needed their suffering to validate my survival. I had something better. Distance. Peace. My life now is quiet in the best possible way. My firm thrives. My home is mine. My finances are protected. My phone is silent. My name belongs to me. And if you're hearing this story and some part of it feels painfully familiar, if you're the responsible one, the stable one, the daughter or son who is only remembered when there's a mess to clean, a bill to pay, a crisis to absorb, then listen carefully. You are not cruel for refusing to finance your own destruction. You are not selfish for protecting what you built. And you are not disloyal for stepping away from people who only remember you when they need something expensive. Family is not a license. Blood is not a debt. And love that only appears when your resources are needed is not love. It's access. Toxic people always get angry when the person they misused learns the difference between generosity and exploitation. Let them be angry. You are not a backup plan. You are not an emergency fund. You are not the collateral. You are the one who survived long enough to see the pattern clearly. And once you see it clearly, you never owe anyone the right to continue it. So yes, 3 weeks ago, my parents told me that if I didn't pay my sister's $500,000 fraud debt, I was no longer their daughter. They thought that was a threat. What they didn't realize was that it was a release. And the moment they said it, they didn't lose a daughter. They lost the last person in that family who still knew how to save them.